Tip number 5 is read the light. We've talked a lot about the exposure triangle. We've talked a lot about getting a correct exposure, balancing the light, setting the controls. But how do we do this, you might ask? We use the exposure meter in the camera, or light meter as it's often called. This is a device that reads the light and turns it into usable information for us, and it will display in your viewfinder or on your monitor something like this. The first camera I ever owned, this was the only information it had. It was displayed a little differently. There was just a needle in the side of the viewfinder and a plus and a minus, and I knew when that needle was in the center, my exposure was correct. I've met photographers who grew up using the older style cameras that had no built-in light meter, and these guys could tell you what the light reading was and what setting you should set your camera on just by looking and evaluating the light without any instrument to help them. But we have the technology, so let's learn how to use it well. On the light meter, you're looking to read where the light is balanced well, and it's balanced when it's reading 0. If it's heading off towards the plus or heading off towards the minus and the indicator's out in either direction, you're going to either have an overexposed image or an underexposed image. But when we bring the 3 settings in the exposure triangle, our ISO, our shutter speed and our aperture, into balance, this is when the light meter will read 0 and you know you're getting a correct exposure. As I've mentioned, the light meter reads reflected light, and as we know, different tones, different colors reflect different amounts of light. A black object and a white object are going to give a very different reading to a light meter because they reflect different amounts of light. So we need to learn to choose where we read the light from and how we set the exposure meter depending on what we're framing in our camera. We will also find variation where there is different amount of light falling in a scene. For example, if we're shooting on a sunny day and there's bright sunshine and hard shadows, dark shadows, the light meter will take a very different reading from where the sunshine is being reflected and where the shadows are falling. So we need to be careful and learn how to choose which part of the image to take the light meter reading from. The camera's light meter sees middle grey, so it's reading in between the darkest part and the brightest part of an image and looking at the average in the middle. This is why it's easier to get clear, well-exposed photographs under softer lighting conditions where there's not so much contrast. Many cameras will offer 3 or more options for how you set your light meter, and it's good to know the differences between these things. I often have my camera set to matrix or evaluative metering mode. In this mode, the camera reads from a number of sections across the entire frame and averages the value of the light and gives you a reading. The other exposure meter setting I use is the spot meter. This takes a reading from between 2 and 5% of the frame and is either centered in the middle of your frame or set to where your focus point is, depending on the camera that you're using. The other common exposure meter setting is the center weighted, which reads from 60 to 80% from the center of the frame. This is one I don't use very often because I find a better balance using the matrix and spot meter settings. The matrix or evaluative meter setting gives me a good feel for the overall light in the frame, and quite often then I'll switch to spot meter and have a look at some areas that are bright or dark, or usually the area of the frame, the part of my composition that I consider most important. For example, if I'm photographing a person, I want to take a reading just from their face because this will be the most vital part of the image And the spot meter is most useful in strong lighting situations where there's high contrast, where you really need to be more precise with your light meter reading and setting of your exposure. Being able to use the camera's monitor to check the exposure is also very helpful. Typically when I'm shooting, I'll take a light meter reading, I'll set my exposure, shoot a frame, and then check the monitor and have a look. And if I feel it's out a little bit, I'll make some adjustments and shoot a little bit more. So using the exposure meter and the camera's monitor will help you get a well-exposed image. And as you become more familiar with your camera settings, as you become more practiced in using the exposure meter, you will be more creative with your camera.